morning, everyone. Welcome to researchED Home. This morning, we are ending the week with some maths, and we have Simon Cox joining us. You're a maths teacher, Simon, and he's also a maths content specialist for the EEF. So as such, he has contributed to different guidance reports. Simon is also director of Blackpool Research School. It's a really exciting position, but he's also co-organizer of researchED Blackpool, so a very, very busy man, and is in school today, and I'm really, really grateful that he could join us this morning. So I'm going to pass it on to Simon, and Simon, if you're ready, please take over.
Thank you, Helene, for that introduction. If I just share my screen and we'll make a start. Okay, so as Helene said there, my name's Simon Cox. I'm the content specialist for maths for the Education Endowment Foundation. I am a maths teacher. I'll be open and honest with you, I'm not an early years specialist. I'm a secondary maths teacher. I've taught in Blackpool schools for 16 years now, and I'm in school today. You can probably tell from the background behind me there of the classroom, sadly empty at the moment. But I'll be sharing with you in my EEF role, if you like, some of the evidence that we found around early mathematics, early years mathematics, and what we can do to sort of deepen that understanding of mathematics in our youngest learners. Just a little bit about what we do at the EEF first. So we think of our work as fitting into three categories. So first of all, we have synthesis, and this is where we gather together existing evidence, most famously, I would say, in our teaching and learning toolkit, but also there is an early years toolkit, which far fewer people seem to know about, and that is obviously covering those early years and the specific things that seem to work for the youngest children. And there's also evidence reviews and so on in there as well. We then generate new evidence, and this is probably one of the things that EEF has become most famous for over the last 10 years, the trials, and these are usually randomized control trials. There's around 200 of them that have either published or are in progress at the moment. And a huge number of schools have taken part in those. We're over 13,000 schools currently that have taken part in some form of an EEF trial. And then mobilisation, and this is where we have things like our guidance reports, where we look to help schools to put the evidence into practice. We're completely aware, you know, I'm a school teacher, a school leader. I know how busy teachers are, and it's really, really difficult sometimes to digest some of the more obscure evidence and spend the time reading those sort of journal articles and things like that. So one of the things that we do is bring out these guidance reports, and that's going to be the focus of my talk this morning. We also have our research school network, and there's now 40 schools involved in the research school network. So wherever you are in the country, there will be one not too far from you. So if you're interested in engaging with them, do have a look at the Research Schools website, and you'll see where your nearest one is. So thinking specifically around mathematics then, again, coming back to this early years toolkit, there's a strand within the toolkit on early numeracy approaches and some of the things that look like they might be effective within that strand there. In terms of generation of evidence, we've got a number of projects which have either completed or are ongoing around early mathematics. So first class at number is one example. That's in our promising projects. That means that the outcome of that trial suggested that it might be worth schools considering. And also one of the ones that's ongoing at the moment is done through the National Day Nursery Association, and that's Maths Champions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in my talk. And in mobilisation, we had a guidance report come out a couple of years ago for Key Stage 2 and 3 mathematics. And more recently, in January of this year, we had one come out on early years and Key Stage 1. Our core purpose, our mission as an organisation, is to look at disadvantage and to try to break that link between family income and educational achievement. And that sometimes can get lost because I think a lot of people think of EEF as being a grant-making charity and running the trials, but actually we are running those trials to see what works in particular for breaking that link between family income and educational achievement. So why do we think early maths matters, and early years in particular? So we have found that early years education has huge promise in preventing that attainment gap becoming entrenched. You can see from the graphic there and the report that's referenced at the bottom of the screen that the gap widens. We know this. It starts relatively small in early years, but it grows bigger and bigger as children move through school. And what we've found is that there's real promise actually in early years education in stopping that gap getting too big too soon. And clearly that fits in with our core purpose as an organisation and all of our core purpose as educators. Specifically mathematically though, we've found that early understanding of number in particular is a really strong predictor of children's later mathematical achievement. Not only that though, it's also a really strong indicator of achievement overall. So those children that grasp number early on do tend to go on to do better academically in all subjects later on in school. So clearly, if we can help children to grasp these concepts early on, it increases their chance of later success. And sadly, one thing that we also have found is that once children do fall behind, they are unlikely to catch up. Now, there are things that we can do and that we know that help with catch up, but a lot of the evidence suggests that it is really, really difficult to get children to catch up. And the best thing to do is to actually try to not let them fall behind in the first place. And we believe that one of the ways that we can really try to address these issues is through a combination of the use of evidence, but also together with professional expertise. And I think it's really important that we don't see evidence as being the solution. It helps us along our way towards this goal of evidence-informed practice, but it needs to be taken together with professional expertise, with context, place matters and things that work here in Blackpool might not work so easily in Manchester or in London or elsewhere. So I think it's a combination of the evidence with that professional expertise that could really help us in addressing these issues. So the main focus of my talk this morning is on the guidance report that came out in January, Improving Maths in the Early Years and Key Stage 1. This and everything else that I will reference this morning will be freely available on the EEF website. So if you just do a quick Google search, you'll find the full copy of this report, together with any associated tools and resources which we bring out that link to this. So I thought it'd be interesting and useful for me to just quickly talk through the approach that we take when writing one of these guidance reports. They tend to be about sort of 30 to 40 pages in length, so relatively short documents, but we do go through quite a rigorous and intensive process in order to get there. So we start out with our initial scope, talking to key academics, talking to organisations, gathering the views of teachers, to start to think about what the scope of this report should be and what our research questions might be that we're looking to answer. We then appoint our guidance panel, and these are a collection of experts who guide us through that process. They help us translate the evidence findings into more practical recommendations that are likely to be useful for school leaders and for classroom teachers. We then appoint an evidence reviewer. So in this case, it was led by Jeremy Hodgen, who also led actually on the Key Stage 2 and 3 guidance report that came out a couple of years ago. But it included lots of other people. So Camilla Gilmore, for example, who's an expert in mathematical cognition, and various other people were involved in that part of the process. So they externally from EEF, so it's not EEF that conducts the evidence review, so externally they conduct the evidence review, and they look at randomised control trials, they look at all sorts of different evidence that's out there, both UK-based and international evidence as well, and look at sort of what actions practitioners can take to try and impact upon attainment in maths. One of the reports that we drew quite heavily on was a 2013 guide from the What Works Centre in the US, and they did a report on early maths teaching. Again, their reports tend to be much lengthier than EEF's reports, but again, there's some really good information in there which we used as well in forming our evidence base for this one. Also, the EEF toolkit comes in as well, as you would expect. And then finally, we write the guidance report. It goes out for comments to people like our Research School Network to have a final look over it. And then it was published last January. And all in all, that's around about an 18-month piece of work that goes into producing one of these guidance reports. We did find that there was less evidence overall for younger children than there was in the Key Stage 2 and 3 review, but there were certain things that came out as being strong, and they were the things that went into the final report. And as we always say with these are our best bets, if you like. So we're not saying that the things in the report will work in all contexts all the time, and we're not saying that schools should work their way through the report and try and implement everything that's in there. They are our best bets, and obviously context and expertise matter as well. Just going back to the scope of the report then, we decided early on that we were going to look at early years and Key Stage 1 together, and it is focused on ages 3 to 7, and I know early years can be a bit wider than that, but it is particularly ages 3 to 7 that went into the evidence base. We made this decision for a number of reasons. First of all, we'd had some really positive feedback from our Key Stage 2 and 3 maths guidance report, in that it was cross-phase, and there was real value in practitioners from across those phases working together. We generate training off the back of these reports that our Research Schools Network leads on, and one of the real sort of positive feedback from those sessions was having that opportunity to work with people from other phases. So Key Stage 3 teachers working with Key Stage 2 teachers was really beneficial. So that was one of the reasons why we decided to make this another cross-phase report. But also that we found that the best bets were very similar across early years and Key Stage 1. We understand that there are pedagogical differences between the two phases, there are curriculum differences between the two phases, but actually the best bets in terms of the evidence were very similar. So for those reasons, we decided to make this another cross-phase report that went across those two phases of early years and Key Stage 1. And once all that had taken place, we distilled the evidence down and we came up with our 5 recommendations. And I'm going to briefly, because we haven't got a huge amount of time this morning, but I'm briefly going to talk through each of these, some in more detail than others, and some of the things that we found might be useful for settings to think about in their own practice. I'll also talk briefly at the end about what isn't in there and why it's not in there. There's 1 or 2 things that you might think should be in there, but I'll talk about why they didn't make it to the final report. So starting then with the first recommendation, which is this idea of developing practitioners' understanding of how children learn mathematics. And this really underpins the rest of the guidance. What we found was that this idea of developing practitioners' understanding of how the learning of mathematics takes place, as well as the maths content, but actually the sort of understanding of how the learning takes place was really, really important, and how that relates to effective pedagogy was also found to be really important. So maths knowledge itself obviously is very important for practitioners to have, but how do children develop that mathematical thinking? And some of the things that we found within this recommendations were that it wasn't just specifically mathematical things that mattered here, but also things like executive functions, so things like working memory, self-regulation, metacognition skills, language skills, motor skills, children's prior understanding, children's interests, their enjoyment, their attitudes towards mathematics. These things all mattered in the learning of mathematics. So that I think sort of underpins the rest of the report. And I think that there's some interesting things, certainly for me as a non-specialist, that came out in here. So counting is a good example. I think as a non-specialist early years practitioner, I previously probably just thought that children just learned to count. And it's working with my own children that I noticed that actually, yes, children learn to count and they learn the count sequence and things like that, but they don't necessarily understand that when they have finished counting a set of objects, the last number they said refers to the number of objects in the set. So I would ask my little boy to count 4 counters, for example, and he'd go 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'd ask him, so how many are there? And he'd just do it again, 1, 2, 3, 4. He didn't understand that 4 was the number of items in that set. And that's one of the steps, as early years practitioners will be fully aware, of of learning to count. This idea that the last number that you say is the number of items in that set. So that kind of sort of understanding of that development in learning, not just to count, but in all areas of maths, we found to be really important. And that understanding of how children learn mathematics helps practitioners then to plan the learning and the experiences, to assess what children can do and can't do, to provide appropriate challenge. And we feel that that hopefully is exemplified through the rest of the guidance report. One thing that's really attracted quite a lot of attention from this section of the report are these spirals. And there's not just one of these, there's three of these. There's one for number, there's one for calculation, and there's one for shape and geometry. And we agonized over how to present these, because we were really clear, obviously, that the evidence suggests that development isn't linear, and that children don't just start at one end of a line and learn all of the things in that order until they get to the other end. That's not how learning happens, certainly not how learning happens in early maths. So we decided on this spiral approach just to try and break that sort of linear visual. But we're not saying that children will develop these skills in the order in which they appear on the spiral. You might find that some of these are sort of being developed in parallel. You might find that some come before others, and so on. But we thought this was really valuable. These sort of relatively simple diagrams, and these are based on a wider range of evidence about learning, to sort of summarize some of these key stages and operations in children's learning of mathematics. But what we do hope is these are a starting point. So these aren't the sort of final product. This is a starting point for further reading, for further investigation of what some of these things mean in a little bit more detail. One of the things that we're looking to develop are interactive versions of these spirals, so that will be hosted on our website, which people can then sort of click into, and it will give more information about a particular aspect of learning early number, perhaps with some suggested activities and case studies from Research School Network and beyond sort of built in there. So that's a longer term project that I'm working on at the moment that we're hoping to develop in the future. I would just point people's attention, though, if that's something that interests you in particular, there is a website, it's a US website called Learning Trajectories, and this is based on the work of two US researchers, Clements and Samara. And they've done really substantial research into this area, and they've developed 17 detailed progressions across number, shape, and space, and they are paired with some practical activities as well. So it's a free website. You do have to create a login in order to access the learning trajectories, but hopefully that will be some sort of further reading on that for those people who are interested in that. Okay, coming on to recommendation 2 then. So this is where we start to look in a bit more detail at some of the things that we found from the evidence might sort of help in the learning of mathematics. And this is about dedicating time for children to learn mathematics and integrating mathematics throughout the day. So one of the things that came out really strongly from the evidence review was that time set aside for explicit teaching of mathematics is required for children to form more sophisticated mathematical pictures and connections. Now, I will just clarify that when we're talking about explicit teaching, we're not talking here about formal learning, obviously in the early years. So we're talking about short, active, playful activities. We're certainly not talking about what, sort of people sat in rows and that kind of thing. So it's short, active, it's playful. And the evidence suggests that the sort of short and frequent would be best. There's lots and lots of suggestions in the guidance report for strategies and things that might help with that. So, for example, discussing maths in storybooks, discussing mathematical games, doing puzzles, singing number rhymes, jumping on a number line, clapping, and all those different things. And there's more detail about those things in the report. Just a couple of areas where evidence was particularly strong that I'd like to pull out. So games was an area where we found particularly strong evidence, and what we found with this is that board games which featured linearly numbered sequences where the squares or circles, in the case of the diagram on the screen there, are all the same size, and board games that met those criterias criteria came out quite strongly in the evidence base. There's some work on from Siegler and Romani that's worth looking up on this, and they basically did an experiment where children played with number squares and other children played with coloured squares with no numbers, and they found that the children who used the numbered squares made more progress in the understanding of number than those children that played simply just with the coloured squares. And I think here, this idea of counting on is important, and particularly important in the use of these boards. So the top diagram there, the caterpillars, that's one that comes directly from the guidance report. The evidence team were happy, though, that the other board games could be used as long as they met the criteria of linearly numbered spaces, which are equal in size. I have to say, just through experience of playing with my little boy, I have a little bit of an issue with snakes and ladders in that the numbers switch direction. So they go 1 to 10, and then they go 11 to 20. And I find that's a little bit confusing, especially with later number line work, obviously usually going left to right. So that would just be a word of warning, really, an anecdotal word of warning from my personal experience. So the top board is the one that we included there in the guidance report. There's also strong evidence around using storybooks in the learning of mathematics, but where they are explicitly supporting and promoting mathematical discussion. So we're not talking here about making all reading about maths. This is specifically stories which have a mathematical content which relates to the mathematics that's being studied at that time, are particularly useful. And there's a few questions down the side of the screen there which we feel sort of might help practitioners to think about the storybooks that they're using and how they're using them. So this idea about identifying the mathematical content within a storybook, discussing sort of questions to ask during reading, perhaps as a team, thinking about the vocabulary that's in there and whether that will require pre-teaching and might be developed outside of the reading of the story at other times in the day, and possibly mathematical follow-up activities as well. One of the pieces of research that went into this recommendation actually used cue cards. So practitioners had thought about the questions that they were going to ask and discuss with the children, and they had cue cards with those questions written on, so that as it came to that point in the story, they could sort of develop that thinking there as well. Interestingly, this evidence was not just focused on early years, so it was found to be effective across all age groups in school rather than just early years, but obviously we're focused on early years and Key Stage 1 within this report here. And there are a number of good websites, and there's a couple referenced in the report that have got suggestions for storybooks that have got a particular mathematical focus, and you can see a few of them there on the screen. One of the things we've really tried to do with this evidence review is exemplify as much as possible, and we've included lots of examples from settings and schools of how these recommendations might look in practice. And there's one here, this came from a nursery school in London. And this is around this idea of highlighting mathematics during the day. So the first part of the recommendation was about explicit teaching of mathematics, obviously within an early years context. This is more about highlighting maths throughout the day. So things like routines, snack times, transitions, registration when children arrive in a morning are all things that could have a mathematical link to them, and that mathematics can be highlighted during play as well, and also in other curriculum areas. So we found good evidence for this, but again, I think coming back to the storybooks example, a lot of this was in the planning. So thinking carefully about, okay, if we're going to have a mathematical aspect to our, let's say, registration routine. So when the children arrive in the morning, I've seen one nursery which the children stick their picture onto a tens frame, and then together they count sort of how many children are there on that particular day. So linking it to the mathematics that those children are learning at that time, but also thinking about how that's going to develop. So how are we going to change that so that the mathematics in that routine develops as the children develop further understanding of mathematics. So instead of asking, for example, how many children are there, could we ask how many children are not there? Could we look at the tens frames and actually think, well, I can see I've got 2 groups of 10, and then count the sort of units after that. So thinking about ways in which the mathematics within that routine can develop as time goes by. And snack time is a classic example, and the example that's on here comes from snack time as well. We also found within this recommendation that discussion of mathematical ideas was really, really important. So things like sustained shared thinking and guided interaction worked really, really well with mathematics, and practitioners using question stems and open questions in order to bring out the mathematics in discussions and talk the children through what they were thinking and what they were understanding. Also on that, there was elements of vocabulary. So we found that consistent use of vocabulary across a setting or school was important, that it could be informal at first, so talking about shapes as being curvy or pointy, for example, but then should progress towards more formal vocabulary over time. So, for example, refining when a child talks about something as being big when they actually mean it's tall, and actually sort of using and prompting the sort of correct vocabulary over time. I referred earlier briefly to one of our trials, which is ongoing at the moment, and this is run with the National Day Nursery Association. It's called Maths Champions, and it looks at making maths more of a focal point, so spending more time discussing maths with children, preparing maths resources, developing mathematical language, and we found on an early trial of Maths Champions that children's made an additional 2 months progress compared to children in the control group. So we're now looking to run an effectiveness trial, sort of scale that up across more settings and using a bigger sample of children to see if that finding does scale up. So watch out for that. Third recommendation then, and this is the recommendation that's common across both of our guidance reports now. So Key Stage 2 and 3 and early years and Key Stage 1 both have this same recommendation about using manipulatives and representations to develop understanding. And there's such a strong evidence base. This is probably the strongest that we've found across mathematics teaching in terms of an evidence base, this idea of using manipulatives. So manipulatives are a really powerful tool to engage children with the mathematics, not just sort of formal manipulatives, but things like pine cones, various different things that the settings have, also counters, and we found particular strong evidence for building blocks, things like interlocking cubes, etc. So yeah, lots of principles that we found at Key Stage 2 and 3 for the use of manipulatives also transferred over to early years and Key Stage 1. So this idea of understanding and developing the link between the manipulative and the mathematical idea it represents is really important. We found that explicit teaching of how to use the manipulatives was needed. So rather than just giving children manipulatives, although there is a place for that early on, sort of playing with the manipulatives and getting to know them, actually sort of developing that link between the mathematical idea and the manipulative being used. Also, we found that it's important to choose the right manipulative to teach a particular concept, and that required thought and alignment sort of across development stages. So for example, counters encourage count all, but actually the child might be ready to count on. So counters might not be the most appropriate manipulative to use under those circumstances. And as I mentioned, there's particularly promising evidence of building blocks for shape and spatial understanding that came out of that. We also found that whole body movement was important in representing mathematical ideas. So physically moving along a number line, for example, jumping, clapping. We found that rhythm was important in learning to count, and children's use of fingers should be encouraged. Fingers are a really important manipulative, initially for counting, but then for counting in groups and so on. And that's something that, again, also came out in the Key Stage 2 and 3 guidance report, when I think possibly traditionally at that kind of age we used to discourage children from using their fingers, but actually it's a really positive manipulative that should be encouraged across the age range. Just on representations as well, we found that children using their own representation of their mathematical ideas was really important, and there is an example of that within the guidance report. So rather than jumping too soon to sort of telling them how to represent a mathematical idea, encouraging them to represent mathematical idea in their own way. Initially, we found an evidence base for that. Again, I will bring back in discussion here, because the concept of discussion goes throughout this entire guidance report, and I think manipulatives can be really effectively used to encourage discussion of mathematical ideas with a more sort of concrete representation. Okay, moving on to recommendation 4 then, and this recommendation was about ensuring that teaching builds upon what children already know. So it's focused around formative assessment, collecting information about what children already know in order to develop their mathematics. And we found within this evidence base that teaching, to be really effective, needs to be informed by what children already know about mathematics. And it's about what they do know as well as what they don't know. And I think this is particularly important in early years. Children enter education, well, first of all, at different ages, but also with very different levels of mathematical understanding depending on their prior experiences. And settings should look to build on that was the finding that came out in this recommendation. We found here that there was clear link to those developmental progressions that I mentioned earlier on. So that idea of practitioners having that good understanding of what mathematical development looks like feeds into sort of interpretation of observation and using that to inform teaching. But what we did find was this is really, really difficult to do well, especially thoughtful observation and interpreting the observation findings in order to inform future teaching. And this is especially difficult with very young children who seem like they know something 1 minute and in one context and then not the next or the next day or whatever. So it's about building up this picture across different contexts through spontaneous opportunities, but also through some planned tasks as well. And that, again, linking back to that recommendation 2 idea of this really careful questioning, listening to children's reasoning. There are a number of examples of this, again, within the guidance report, about this idea of spontaneous observation and discussions, and also about planning tasks. We decided with this guidance report to really exemplify as much as possible. So there are quite a lot of examples within there. This is one of them. It's from Sheringham Nursery School in London, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on that, but that's just as an example for you of the kind of exemplifications really that are built into the report. This one, just to give an overview, was about children. They were counting as a group from 1 to 20, but what they found was that they couldn't actually tell when children were counted as a group from 1 to 20 who was getting it right and who was getting it wrong. So finding a way of sort of working with those individual children within that activity was the focus of that activity there. And then on to the final recommendation, which is about using high quality targeted support to help all children learn mathematics. So a lot of the evidence from this finding came from another EEF report on making best use of teaching assistants. I'm fully aware, by the way, that because this report goes cross-phase, we sometimes use language that isn't applicable to a particular, so I might use early years language that doesn't apply in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 1 language that doesn't apply in early years, but the principle sort of behind that language is roughly the same. So what we found here in terms of using this sort of targeted support was using more experienced staff to support children with the greatest needs was important, but that any staff involved in this kind of work needed training and significant support in order to sort of effectively do this. So things like structured resources, activity plans with clear objectives built in. We found that any sort of targeted support sessions needed to be brief and regular. That goes back to that point about explicit teaching as well. Brief and regular is far better at this stage, and we found that quality was more important than quantity, and there is some evidence that time limited interventions might be more effective. Also really important is, and this goes again, this is in general around any kind of intervention, is the idea about making the links between the targeted support and the everyday activities or teaching, and this is always a criticism of intervention, is that intervention doesn't link closely enough to what's going on during the everyday teaching. So making those links, we found was really important. There are a couple of EF trials. I've already mentioned First Class at Number, which is a programme in Key Stage 1 that's delivered by teaching assistants, providing some intensive support. We've also got an app-based promising project, actually, that's applicable at Key Stage 1, which is called 1 Billion. That's a series of apps that support that acquisition of basic mathematical skills, and it's aimed at ages 3 to 6. And that has been through one of our trials and came out as a promising project, so it might be worth exploring. I would just advise a little bit of caution there, because as we are aware from the evidence, anything technology based, we need to think really carefully about how to implement that. And there's a digital technology guidance report that's there on the screen that might support that. So a couple of things that weren't in there. We didn't make any recommendations about transitions between reception and Key Stage 1, for example. There wasn't strong enough evidence for us to include that in the report. Now, we're not saying, of course, that transition isn't important. It is, but we have the same issue here as we do with the Key Stage 2 and 3 report, is that there just isn't a strong evidence base of how best to make those transitions between those phases. So that could be something for future trials, where we look at actually what does work across those kinds of transitions. We didn't make any recommendations within there about parental engagement. We didn't feel there was anything to add over and above the existing parental engagement guidance report that EF have published. Again, it's one of those things where we know that parental engagement in children's learning leads to improved outcomes, but there isn't much evidence on how to encourage more effective parental engagement. Again, there are trials around that, but we didn't feel that the evidence was strong enough for that to go into the report. We also found, in terms of grouping children, that there wasn't significant evidence sort of one way or the other at this phase. But I think we need to look a bit beyond the evidence here anyway, and ask, why we might want to put such young children into different groups. And we just found that wasn't an area that was applicable to the report. So in terms of what's next and what comes next, so we're developing some tools and resources to support settings and schools in implementing some of the findings of this. And over the coming months, we'll have a sort of 3 phases to this work. And the first phase is around mainly recommendation 2, which is around the explicit teaching of mathematics, but also finding those mathematical moments throughout the day, and sort of developing those. So we've got an audit tool which will be coming out this side of summer, which is aimed really at helping settings to look at where they are currently in terms of the evidence report, and thinking about where they might want to prioritise. So we by no means think that anyone should take this report and try and implement the whole thing at once. So the audit tool is really useful, we hope, for that. We've got the full evidence review, again, hopefully coming out this side of the summer holidays. That's the evidence review that Jeremy Hodgson and the team put together, which we then use to slim it down into the guidance report. So if you're interested in looking in any more detail, particularly about why I think some things didn't make the review, that will be interesting. We've got a series of tools for schools and parents that are going to come too. So we've got some animations, particularly around this idea of maths throughout the day. Some planning tools, again, around storybooks and some of the questions there that settings might ask themselves. Some of those questions and prompts and those question stems for discussion that we talked about earlier. But I'm really keen to develop examples of these in practice. Obviously, now is not the time to do that, but hopefully as we move forward and start to approach something a bit closer to normal, then really getting some voices from the classroom about how people have put some of these ideas into practice within their own settings. We're also, as I've already mentioned, looking to develop interactive versions of those spirals, and also watch out for email series and some further voices from the classroom as well. So all that's coming out over the coming months, really, and some of that will be accompanying the report on the website, hopefully this side of the summer holidays. So thank you very much for listening this morning. I hope it's been useful. And I think we've got some time left for possible questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you, Simon. Someone was asking earlier, I know it's not directly the thing that you were talking about, but about the guidance for guidance in context for Key Stage 2 as well. So I've sent the link to the report that exists. And that was released a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's a couple of years ago now, and there is already an existing audit tool for the Key Stage 2 and 3 one. We also have a research school training program around that. So again, if that's something you're interested in developing further, it could be worth contacting your local research school about that. But yeah, that's been up a couple of years now, and has been really popular. And again, it was cross-phase Key Stage 2 and 3, because we actually found that, I think we make these arbitrary line in the sand, don't we, when we transfer from primary to secondary school. But what we found in terms of the best bets for teaching is they are very similar across Key Stage 2 and 3, and we shouldn't see them as being mathematically different.
Thank you. I haven't actually seen the audit tool. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's it's a RAG rating, basically. So it takes each of the 5 recommendations for early years, but it was 8 recommendations for Key Stage 2 and 3, and it unpicks in a bit more detail some of the stuff from the report, and it basically asks schools to think about red, amber, green, where you are at the moment. Now, it is quite a blunt tool. You can't develop all the different nuances of different schools' practice. We found it useful. I mean, we used it in my school when the report first came out. So we, as a department, what we did actually was we individually RAG rated, and then we came together as a maths department and looked at the similarities between what we'd done, maybe some of the differences between what we'd done, and we used that to form our plan as a department moving forward. And the recommendation that we picked out initially was the one around manipulatives. I think I can say this as a secondary school teacher, I don't think manipulatives across the board have been used historically particularly well in secondary maths, and I think we had a lot to learn from primary about that. There are exceptions to that, obviously, but that was our focus, and we drew up a 2-year plan of how we were going to introduce manipulatives and which manipulatives and where they were going to link to our scheme of learning. So it's really, we see the audit tool as a starting point for conversations like that. It's to see where you think you're at as a team, and to think about ways you might sort of develop off the back of that.
That point on manipulatives, it was particularly useful in the Key Stage 2-3 guidance report, because it's really nicely exemplified, and there's a lovely discussion around that.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to go back to that question about that Key Stage 2-3 report, the person asking was asking about, are there examples of that in context? So you've given this morning examples of incidental maths opportunities throughout the day with EYS. Mm-hmm. I can't remember in the Key Stage 2 report there being any examples of like in context or incidental opportunities.
No, and that wasn't one of the recommendations actually that came out in Key Stage 2 and 3 specifically. That was there was only the manipulatives one that was common across the 2 reports. So this idea of finding mathematical moments throughout the day, we're not saying that that's not appropriate at Key Stage 2, but we're saying it didn't come out as strong enough in the evidence to go into the report. The thing that did go cross-phase, however, was the use of storybooks. So it didn't make it to the Key Stage 2-3 report, but the evidence around storybooks does suggest that it's a useful tool across all ages. So again, that could be something that's relevant to Key Stage 2 about finding sort of relevant mathematical storybooks. There's a great website called Maths Through Stories. If you just Google that, you'll find the website, and that recommends mathematical storybooks with mathematical focus for all ages, and that goes right up to sort of much older children as well. So that's worth having a look at.
Thank you. Can we just go back to this question of language? And you said that sometimes the language you use in the report that you were talking about today might be more appropriate for Key Stage 1 rather than EYS, or the other way around. Have you found that problematic in the feedback that you've had? Some people perhaps also may have some issues with the language around explicit teaching, and I know you touched on it earlier. Can you say a little bit more perhaps about that?
A little bit problematic. I think we had that decision to make over, do we go cross-phase with this and accept there will be some challenges in terms of the language that we use, but we felt that the benefits of going cross-phase outweighed the negatives. But yes, you are right. So for example, teaching assistants is not a term that's used in early years, but features in the report because the Key Stage 1. Also, you're right about explicit teaching, and I think this comes out in the evidence review that we were really clear that explicit teaching meant actually taking that time to teach the mathematics directly, but not. I think when we say explicit teaching, people always conjure up an image, don't they, of children sat in rows facing the front listening to the teacher. That is absolutely not what we were saying here when we talk about explicit teaching. We were talking about finding time in the day to focus explicitly on mathematics, but the teaching will happen through stories, through play, through discussion, and all of those other different things that I mentioned. The use of, again, we in the Key Stage 2 and 3 report, we always refer to teachers, but obviously that wasn't necessarily the right term to use in the early years in Key Stage 1. So we decided on practitioners as sort of catch-all term. But again, I understand that that's not always an ideal term. Basically, when we say practitioners, we're talking about anybody that's working sort of within those settings directly with the children on the learning of mathematics. So yeah, some issues with the language, but we felt that the benefits of cross-phase outweighed the negatives.
Thank you. And so for those moments of explicit teaching, would you then, particularly in a EYS setting, would you then take a group of children and then take them to a corner of the classroom perhaps, and then have that moment of teaching? Because I remember some of the debates when the report came out, and some teachers feeling that perhaps that was a sort of imposition.
Yeah, I think there's. I mean, I'm not an early years practitioner, so I don't. I'm not 100% familiar with the sort of day-to-day ins and outs. Obviously, I've been to early years settings, but yeah, the evidence did suggest that it is important to find those. Now, how to do that would obviously be up to those individual settings. It could be that those moments happen during play, for example. So it could be that we have a particular focus and that the practitioners, whilst children are playing on a particular task or whatever it is that has been set up, they sort of use that moment to sort of bring out that mathematics. So again, it's really hard. I appreciate that, and it's really difficult to think about what that might look like in an early years setting, but really just finding those moments at some point throughout the day. Short, that was one of the things that came out of the report, is it should be short and it should be frequent, but not necessarily sort of what we'd call traditional teaching.
Someone is asking if you think there is a role for textbooks in EYFS.
Goodness, that sounds like a loaded question. I'm gonna sit on the fence on that one and say I don't know, because it's not something that came out in the evidence review. I'm not aware of early years settings using textbooks. Obviously, I'm a secondary practitioner, and there are definitely benefits later on of using textbooks, as long as they are high quality. But I'm gonna say I don't know on that one, because it's not something that came out in the evidence review. It's not something I've got any experience of.
Thank you. You were talking about the role of TAs, and you mentioned the report as well on effective deployment of teaching assistants. Do we have, I mean, there's several things there. first in terms of the types of interventions that we're talking about, and two, the timing of those interventions. Is there any evidence that one type of intervention or the timing of an intervention is more effective than others? And does that take them away from, the rest of the provision?
And I think that's a really important point to make, and it comes out in the TA guidance and also in various other of our guidance reports. I think what we're finding increasingly is that teaching assistant-led interventions that come with high quality training, there's quite a lot of very effective programs out there. And when you look at our promising projects on the EF website, they're the ones, the trials that we have done that we feel are worth exploring further. For various reasons. A lot of those are led by teaching assistants, and they come with, with good training and good support. A sort of feature of a lot of these is the short and frequent. So rather than lengthy intervention, we are talking, some of them are literally like 10, 15-minute sessions that are done regularly. There is evidence around, it's actually older children, this one, so I'm not 100% sure how this transfers across, but there is evidence that you need to think really carefully about what the children would have been doing when that intervention takes place. So I know at a secondary level, it's often art subjects, it's often sports subjects that suffer for maths and English intervention, for example, and there is evidence that that might not be the best way to go, because if you look at the toolkit, arts participation and sports participation come out reasonably high. So those are things that we need to be really, really mindful of. And with any intervention, the evidence suggests that there should be a link between that intervention and what's going on in the regular classroom teaching. And I think, again, that's a mistake that's often been made in the past, where they get taken out for maths intervention and their maths teacher has no clue what's happening in that maths intervention session. That's not a good way of delivering intervention. And there's evidence that suggests that there needs to be that really close link between intervention and what's going on in the classroom. And I think that's particularly relevant actually today when we're hearing the announcement of the tutoring program that's coming in, and thinking about actually how does the tutoring that's going to take place, okay, it isn't early years, it's older, but how is that going to link to what's going on in the classroom? Because there's evidence to suggest that is really important.
I remember specifically someone talking about how effective it was to kind of pre-teach or to prepare for what's going to be happening in the lesson. So starting that little intervention at the start of the day or before the lesson, so that the pupils can then join the lesson and do so from a more confident position, if you like.
Yeah.
Okay, can you recommend ideas for catch-up in year 7, please?
Off the top of my head, no, but I would say have a look at our trials, because there's a number of programs within there that are relevant both to primary and secondary settings. Obviously, particular challenge in that we're going to get year 7s coming through, obviously, who've had a very difficult end to their time at primary school, and I think there's going to be some very careful considerations for secondary schools to make there. There's nothing sort of anecdotally that I have used that I'd suggest as a particularly strong sort of catch up, other than obviously we always come back to just really great teaching and making sure that teaching for all children is of high quality as we can make it, regardless of prior attainment, and looking at the evidence around great teaching and making sure that that's really embedded within maths departments, I think is the primary starting point. But specific programs, no, nothing I would recommend.
Okay. And finally, perhaps you said something about grouping in early years, and that doesn't come as a recommendation in your report. Do you know whether or not schools actually, or early settings, do use groupings, and what are perhaps the different types of rationale behind that?
Yeah, not that I know of in an early years setting. It's not something that I've experienced. I have experienced it in a Key Stage 1 setting. mainly, I mean, we're talking in here about sort of within class groupings rather than sort of separate classrooms for different children. And I think it comes back really to the wider evidence base around setting and streaming and all those different things. And actually, in the toolkit, we separated it out. I don't know if it was last year or the year before, into within class groupings and ability grouping. And actually, the within class groupings came out as being far more positive than sort of the traditional, I would say, secondary way of setting children. I think it's a really, I think it's an area where more research is needed. I think we need to be really careful whenever we're recommending anybody switches from what they currently do, because it can lead to some additional problems. So, for example, a secondary school deciding in September that they're going to go from setting, which most secondary schools still do, particularly in the core subjects, towards mixed attainment teaching. I think, you know, that needs a significant staff training behind it. It needs a lot of thought. It shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction, and any kind of change in your grouping structure, I think, needs to be really carefully thought through. I mean, I'll put my hands up. I've taught 16 years. I have never taught mixed ability maths in any of the schools I've ever worked in. And I think I personally would need a lot of time to think about how I was going to do that. So yes, the evidence is there, and it's all in the toolkit around that there is evidence that suggests that setting can be problematic, especially for certain groups of children. But I would urge caution in terms of sort of changing what you're doing without some really careful thought and implementation planning sitting behind it.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Really interesting session, and we will be looking out for all those new tools, and you mentioned the full review as well will be published, so that will be very, very interesting, and we'll look out for those. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And I'll let you get back to work because you're at school, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah, so have a lovely day. Thank you very much. I will make sure that you get the questions in case you want to reflect on those questions. And if there are any more questions, Simon is on Twitter, and it's Maths Mr.
Cox.
That's right. Okay. Will you make the slides available, Simon?
Yes, absolutely, I will do, yeah.
Okay, so we'll make sure that we share those. Okay, have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, we'll see you for the final week of researchED Home next week, and what a week it will be, starting on Monday with Christian Council. So have a great weekend. I'll make sure that I share the programme later on today for next week. Take care. Bye-bye.